Okay, so we're going to talk about advanced security testing in the age of cyber war, and I chose the title with care. It wasn't I wasn't just trying to raise the profile. The reason is there's a lot of things happening which are changing the definition of what the security threat is that we face. And by we, I mean multiple levels, right? There's the commercial aspect of it, there's banks and financial institutions, there's things like the industrial control, chemical plants, nuclear plants, there's the government assets. So at multiple, and consumers, individuals like us are constantly being targeted for attacks. And you only have to open up your email to look at a spear phishing attack where somebody, just a couple of days ago, I got a mail that was from Yahoo that said, hey, your account password has been reset. If you want to contact us, click here. And obviously the first thing you do is delete that email and move on. But this term, the age of cyber war, was used last year by this guy called Roger Thompson, who's a chief threat researcher at ICSA Labs. It's an independent third-party lab that does security research. And the reason he coined the term, and the reason I kind of appropriated it, was the nation states are getting involved now. Before it used to be the 17-year-old teenager sitting in his basement hacking into some target. Now you have countries and governments with vast resources who are getting in there. And if you look at something like Stuxnet, which you've probably heard of, that's a prime example of how powerful this can be. So the thing that's stunning about Stuxnet, it's made headlines everywhere, but there are three things that are unique and a first when it comes to Stuxnet. Does anybody want to guess what that could be?
It was one of the first PLC attacks.
First what?
Programmable logic controller attacks.
That's true. I mean, a part of that is it was one of the first attacks that actually took a cross-platform approach. Theoretically, people said you could do cross-platform malware, where you could go in and the malware figures out, is it Windows, is it Linux, is it a PLC, what kind of CPU is there, and then loads the right code to transmit itself and get to the next level, closer to the target. So it kind of makes its way through multiple avenues and multiple platforms to get to the target that it's after. So very sophisticated, never been done before. That's one.
I don't know if it's what you're looking for, but it was considered to be one of the very first cases of state-sponsored cyber warfare. Yeah.
That's true, but that wasn't that wasn't what I was. That's at a higher level. This was more at a at a security research level. What are the three things that are unique and breakthrough? So the second one was it was the first time that kinetic damage had been done through kinetic, meaning physical damage had been done through a hack. People steal passwords, steal money, but going in and changing the rate at which the centrifuge turns is a first, and people expect more of that sort of stuff. So what's the third thing?
It had a lot of tricks up its sleeve.
That's right.
Many, when one stolen key got revoked, it suddenly had another one.
Yep. So it used 4 zero-day vulnerabilities, and a zero-day attack is an as yet undiscovered vulnerability. There are people know about certain attacks and they try them and use them to make new attacks, and that's common. But 0 days really feed the ecosystem. Once you find an unknown attack, then you can make hundreds of unknown vulnerability. You can make hundreds of attacks that are based on that, and then take advantage of it. And used up to 4, which is quite high for this. So it's quite stunning, and really, to me, it's a warning shot where governments and other labs around the world now know that what's possible, and if governments weren't doing it before, they're starting to look at it now. And as a result, if you look at the last century and say, hey, it was an arms race and there were people, nuclear weapons, and having that was, what was the thing to do, people are predicting that this century it will be about cyber warfare and cyber crime, because you don't need to spend billions of dollars to make a nuclear warhead. You need a bunch of smart people and the internet, and you can get in on the race. So the three trends really that tie into this is there's a growth of targeted attacks. There's a guy at RSA who's a blogger who has a big following. I forget the name right now, but what he's saying is that this fall they're predicting that 30 U.S. national banks are going to be targeted by a group that's called the Hang Up Team. And I don't know how he got the information. Some are saying it's through this Russian hacker who's put up a blog post and is talking about it. But he's predicted that it's going to happen. I hope it doesn't, but it's something to watch out for. And a targeted attack is an attack that knows who the target is, knows what the firewall rules are, what firewall is in place, what kind of operating systems are used, and specifically goes after a target. It's not a general attack that goes after everybody and you just click on a link. Second is the rise of social engineering, and we'll talk more about this. Social engineering is becoming the most common attack vector, right? That people are using to trick someone to give up a password or to click on some link unintentionally and download malware. And they're using Facebook, they're using Twitter, they're using all the social media to transmit the code and get people.
I have an example about that. I recently got an email in my inbox and it said, oh, your transaction has been processed, your purchase has been completed. I was like, yeah, it's a phishing attack, right? Immediately I went to delete it, but then I looked at it and it had my info, like my address, my name, everything the right way. I was like, this looks legitimate. So I went to the website to see my order history, and indeed somebody had ordered a FIFA Managers Cut 2012 game. And I was like, okay, so there is something wrong for sure here. Because in the last 2 years, the only thing I've ordered from that online site is diapers for my kids. So I called them and they immediately refunded my money, but it was a download thing. So the person, whoever either hijacked my session, that means just that session they used to purchase something, then it would be a single occurrence, or they might have got my password. And when it comes to password, I use the same password for multiple things because you have at least 100 to 200 different login accounts. So just to keep a track of that, you're gonna hear more about that in the coming slides as well. So there are subtle differences in different passwords, but in terms of, I realized, okay, if my password is compromised, I have a bigger problem. So I had to go around and change all the passwords. But that's just an example of.
Well, you say that social engineering is becoming the most popular vector. I'd say it was never really, it's always been the most popular vector. It's just becoming more sophisticated. I mean, Kevin Mitnick was not a super hacker by any stretch of the imagination. He was just a guy who was really charismatic and could get passwords out of people when they shouldn't be giving them up. But now, rather than having to have that con man type of personality, you can construct something that looks so convincing to the end user that they're just going to believe what you say, and you don't have to say a word.
Right.
So I think technology has increased the capability of more people to become social engineers versus it just suddenly someone opened a door and social engineering is now huge.
Well, I think very specifically, there's a lot of us in this world of engineering that are very uncomfortable talking to people.
Yeah.
However, you can craft a really nice email
Oh yeah.
or website that is
And when you
social
consider
engineering.
that that's basically how we communicate anymore, even with the Luddites out there. I mean, my wife and I talk more over text than we do over the phone now.
So there's a really interesting article I read that you just reminded me of. There's this guy who was having a conversation with a what he thought was a lady in Russia, and it turned out to be a machine. It was a robot that was so convincing in how it talked to him that the conversations over email continued for months before he figured that, hey, something's wrong here, because everything I say, it has some context when it comes back. But there's no fact-based response to it. And if he says he's going to come over, in a couple of months, the response doesn't reflect that. And it took him a while to figure out that it wasn't a human; it was actually a robot.
Glad he figured that out beforehand.
You
can take social engineering classes and everything. I mean, it's a technique that's been around forever, but
Yeah.
I think it's definitely exploding.
And the third thing that I found really interesting was there's not just a black market, but there's now a market that's above board, a white market for 0 days. So people are, you have arms dealers, right, who say, hey, I'm not immoral, I'm amoral. I just sell the arms to somebody who needs it, and the guy who uses it is the criminal. So you have that happening with exploits as well. You have people you have companies like ViewPen that sells exploits to whoever comes, and pays them the right amount of money, which is a pretty dangerous turn, because in the past you had this honor code that said, hey, I'll be responsible with my disclosure. I'll warn if I find a vulnerability in company X. I'll go to them and warn them and give them 2 months to come out with a patch, tell their users that they need to upgrade the patch. And the newer trend is to not do that, is to go and say, hey, I've got exploits, I've earned it, I've hacked into some system, I'm not breaking the law, but I will sell this to the highest bidder, and we'll talk more about that.
It's interesting you say that, though. You look at the exploit in Stuxnet, that was an 11-month-old printer spooler exploit that used leverage to jump around. That's how it jumped around, was through the print spooler. Where's Microsoft's responsibility? Sure, they're massive and they've got their excuses, that some things do slip through, but 9 months is a long time for no one to find it.
Right.
And yet they find 0 days very often. It's maybe a week or two. It's just for me, the whole Stuxnet thing is interesting when you say people selling them off. I don't know if I should say on a live stream, but it seems like there's a collusion almost between the state-sponsored stuff. It's just a very interesting how you say people selling them.
Yeah,
off.
it is.
That was a very long 0 day.
Right. It is murky and it is difficult because the attack surface is so huge, and we'll get to that when we talk about the testing aspect of it. Any sort of response from a testing standpoint has to be automated, has to be exhaustive to really get advantage and kind of plug the holes before you find it. Any sort of manual approach is going to help find a few flaws, but it's not going to cover the attack surface that's so huge. So go ahead.
Yeah, let's get into a little more interactive Q&A. So between 2005 and 2011, the number of targeted attacks rose by a huge percentage, huge times. What do you think was like 10 times, 50 times, 100, 500 times, or 1,000 times? And targeted attacks are the ones where you know who you're going after and the whole attack is made around that endpoint versus just a generic virus or exploit.
500? I'd say 1,000.
Say 10,000.
So the answer is 500. So Symantec has the Symantec.cloud, app service, and they use heuristics to triage and figure out what's a normal attack versus a targeted attack. And in 2005, they saw 1 per week, and in November of 2011, it was as high as 95 a day, which is quite high in terms of if you look at the ratio of targeted attacks that cause a lot of damage to targets.
Yeah, so this is targeted, and then there are all the other ones, which are generic. So that would be a much bigger pool of attacks anyways. So let's do another one here. One report indicates that people, huge percentage, reuse their password between different sites, myself included.
Me too,
And
but I have classes of sites.
yes. And the difference is maybe just a capitalization or something like that. So what percentage of people do you think reuse their password?
75.
Probably higher.
Wow, you guys are confident it's 95, but when I said I reuse it, everybody was like,
Well,
We're elitists, aren't we?
do as I say, not as I do.
Cobbler's son has no shoes.
it is 75%.
Wow.
And this was exact use. And there's another 8 or 9% if you if you discount things like capitalization and number changes.
Repeating the same first
Right.
letter.
Yeah, or putting like a variable within your password for the month, right? Whenever you change your password, you cycle through certain points of it and whatnot.
So now we know what you do for corporate.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Policy broken.
If only every password was with the same periodicity of change, I would keep it exactly the same. Anyways.
There's hope for society yet.
We had guys at IBM that had passwords that expired at 30, 60, 90, and 180 days. And every 30 days, they would change all of their passwords because it was the only way to keep it straight in their head. But it was the same password for 10 different systems.
Yeah. Yeah, and also it's getting a little tricky because now you have passwords for your grocery store account. You have password for, think about everything. It has a password. So
You have 1 billion people on Facebook, so
One password.
So another question is regarding the exploit. As he mentioned, that exploits are available to be bought, and one exploit was sold for as high as $250,000. And it was in what kind of platform, what kind of system?
I would say Chrome.
Yeah, Chrome.
Flash.
Any other
Yeah.
guesses?
iOS.
Chrome is not big enough target.
Windows 0 Day is absolutely.
You think?
Chrome is not big enough target.
iOS.
Yeah.
In this room?
So there was-
Maybe in this room, but in the general populace?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is
Chrome,
iOS.
Chrome's a huge target because there's like 5 exploits
Chrome is a
for it,
tiny
and they-
target, dude. iOS is a huge target.
Yeah.
Well,
Windows.
Wait.
So there's a
Everyone
whole
with their phones up.
price book, that says if
My
you
grandma's
find
got
a
an
Microsoft
iOS
Word,
device.
exploit 0 day, it's $25,000. I mean, this may not be the actual number, but there is a price book and there's a market that people pay for different types of
Word
exploits.
exploits are useless because the program's probably gonna crash before you can escalate your privileges anyway.
Well, yeah, what data is in Word?
Or at least
You know,
Greg
that you
will.
really want.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's switch now to the response, right? One of the pieces on the response side is security testing. And we believe that in order to stay up with this, massive attack and, really this flood of attacks that are coming to us, you need a system that's agile, that's accurate, and that's simple to use. And I'll explain what I mean by that before we get to the demo and I start, showing pieces of it. But the accuracy, really what we mean is you need to be able to test with the latest attacks and vulnerabilities. You need a feed of new attacks as they happen. If you look at traditional software development, you wait for 3 months and then you get the next patch update. And that pace and that rate of delivery is not going to work. You need to switch to an antivirus model where you're constantly, if I'm a user, if I'm a tester, and I have my product, which is a studio product for testing, security and performance, that system, that VM, is hooked up to the mothership, which is Test Cloud that Tim mentioned, and we're updating Test Cloud with new applications, new attacks, new kinds of tests constantly, and you're getting that download. So you bring up your system, you have the latest attacks in your library, and you can use that to validate your firewall policies or to go do a fuzz attack against the target that you're trying to test.
Yeah, so what we are trying to do is take out all the speed bumps of getting to the latest and the greatest, because traditional solutions, they expect you to update your software, you download it from the support site, and then you load it, you upgrade your firmware, and that's how you get the latest and the greatest. But there are too many speed bumps to keep on top. Nowadays, it's more like I switch it on and it should be the latest and the greatest. It should automatically hook up and make sure that it's the latest list of exploit and apps which I can get.
And the second point is really important there, right? Discover unknown weaknesses in software. Because one thing is to test your firewall and see if it has the signatures to block known attacks that people know about. And that's valuable and that's important and has to be done. But because we're living in a state of compromise, and this is a phrase, living in a state of constant compromise, there was an RSA summit and this year, and people got together, and the conclusion was, hey, we're not going to be able to keep everything out. Stuff is going to get in through the firewall, and we have to deal with the response and the remediation in a quick manner. So finding the 0 day has a huge benefit and upside when you find it and block it before it gets out into the real world. And the way you find the 0 day is using a technique called, one of the ways is to use a technique called fuzzing. And Robert, I think his name is Robert O'Hara in the Washington Post, has a really nice graphic story that talks about what fuzzing is, how you discover it. But in essence, and we'll do that in the demo, in essence it's sending malicious or modified messages to a target to try and fool it to think that it's a valid input, accept it, and then once it's inside the system, it can cause damage. And it can be through a buffer overflow. If it is expecting 1500 bytes, I'm going to send more than that. Or it can be removing a certain field. So it's intentionally mucking with the message construct to enter the system and then cause damage and crash it. Once you crash it, it restarts, and if your message has installed some code in there, when it reboots, it's going to run that new code, right? So that's one of the techniques that people use for finding 0 days. And then there's the agility that we talked about. You need to respond quickly to new attacks and new threats. And the last thing is simplicity. People think of security as this, expert domain thing that 3 people in the company know about security, and it needs to come out. And the Microsoft security development lifecycle talks about how you can put security into regular development process and test process, so that just about anybody, whether you're an IT engineer, whether you're a developer at an NEM or a service provider, you can build in security testing into your workflow and make it simple to use and automate it and use it as a part of your daily build or daily regression cycles. So we talked about Test Cloud just a little bit. We have thousands of ready-to-run tests. We constantly update the library with the latest attacks and applications. Now the thing that I didn't talk too much about was apps and the ability to replicate apps, right? Because attacks don't happen in isolation. The problem is they happen with a lot of valid traffic happening at the same time. So your firewall is processing a lot of good data, and once in a while you have the needle in the haystack that gets in. So you need to look at the problem, and if you increase more of the security policies, your performance goes down. And if you want to increase performance, your security goes down, the risk goes up. So it's two sides of the same coin, and we, on our product, I'll show you in the demo how you can send a lot of application traffic, Facebook, SharePoint, business as well as consumer, and send attacks at the same time, and see in a realistic way how well the firewall does or how well the target behaves.
And one of the things we are seeing in the application standpoint is many of the IT departments, they want to allow people to use their own apps to be productive. Like, if you're using any kind of messenger, it's fine if it makes you productive. But they also want to put in certain other boundaries, because they do not want you to file transfer using that IAM, because that might be a security threat. So they want to get into visibility of your application traffic on the network to the point that they can see, okay, this is an IAM chat versus this is an IAM file transfer. So that's the kind of visibility people are looking at to be able to implement the security policies.